I think what would be great for listeners is to really dive into mitochondria. I know you've really shown many different aspects of understanding mitochondria, and you even talked about how it's just a governor of performance. So can you explain really what that means, and how should we understand the spinning of mitochondria, whether that's too fast or too slow? I don't think a lot of people truly understand that.
I gotcha. So I like getting a little bit hippie first, then getting more into the scientific facts, and then the explanation and like real application. Because if you don't understand like the real basics, so we're talking subquantum level, then nothing upstream really makes sense, right? So if we can look at, and I think it really starts bottom up and top down. So pineal gland being more top down, then bottom up being bottom of our feet. So bottom of our feet, the extensions that connect to the earth. There's a water, mitochondrial, and fascial layer network there that basically connects from big toe to the opposite glute to opposite cortical region to pineal gland. Pineal gland is the antenna extension, which then basically connects with all the cosmic energies and powers, scalar waves, all that cool stuff. So literally from the bottom up being feet to the pineal gland, and then top down being pineal gland to the feet to the earth, we're getting the electron donation from the earth. We're getting all of the different types of waveforms and frequencies from the earth. That's how we are, right? That is the electrodynamic. That's the magnetism. That's how these things actually work. So we're looking so we're talking sub-quantum based stuff. If we look up from there, we'll look more at like the cellular level. So this is more looking at getting cells to communicate with each other. And what happens is with a lot of these cells, they'll have a lipophilic and a hydrophilic end and electrons that'll flux back and forth. And as cells get more dysfunctional because mitochondria can't talk to them and tell them to heal, that electron fluxing stops. The cell membrane gets more rigid. And then all of a sudden you are letting endotoxins in, not letting them out or clearing them. So you start having cell membrane stress. You start having fluxing of electron problems. Then all of a sudden you realize, okay, if cells can't communicate, then mitochondria can't give any input. So now you start to realize, okay, it's this whole electric magnetic side of things that's governing mitochondria and cell communication systems. So if we sidestep, we skip some more deeper quantum field theory, things like that, look at just mitochondria. The cool thing here is, to me, is I think those are the most influenceable things we have. Sure. So these are the communication systems of our body that are anticipatory. So I like saying that and putting a big like check mark next to that, because they're not responding to things we're doing now. They're anticipating. So you said you got in a car wreck last week and your ribs have been hurting all week. But yet as soon as the podcast, before it even started, the pain went away, right? Yep. Because temporarily mitochondria go, okay, we need more neurochemical focus. We need to push more acetylcholine groups, ketone bodies, glucose to the brain. We're going to temporarily turn off TRPV receptors in that area, in the pain area of your rib cage, and push everything to the brain. So mitochondria are that powerful. You can literally, before an event even happens, you can have that effect where it's not putting focus on the pain area, it's focusing on where you actually need it to perform a good podcast. And because you're excited, so brain gets more hemodynamic flow, more oxygen, more nutrients, and all of a sudden you're in the podcast, not in pain. So mitochondria really do dictate everything. And I used to talk about them as being like the lowest level. In reality, it's more that subquantum that's below, but still in terms of influential things that are easier to talk about, mitochondria are a little bit easier. Because then once we get into the subquantum world, the magnetism and electrical and things like that's all super important to understand. That's where we get into the EMF, non-coherent mitigation, but we'll talk about that later. Mitochondria, right? So now we have the basis understanding. Let's look more at the more scientific facts, right? Where people can really kind of latch onto structurally, right? So if you look at them, I always laugh when I say this because the definition in the book is still a sausage-like organelle, right? An ATP producing powerhouse. For sure. And I just think it sounds like, it sounds ridiculous to me. It's a sausage, right? Because in reality, there's so much more to that, right? So you have this outer membrane, that inner membrane, these cristae, which are the invaginations, the little fingers. The cristae is where all the enzymatic action happens. So if you can make peptides and molecules and supplements to modulate the cristae, you can improve enzymatic activity of mitochondria. That's one. Within the middle of it, we have all these floating mitochondrial DNAs, mitochondrial glutathione production, mitochondrial superoxide dismutase, all these cool things on the inside. So if you hear that, you go, okay, I don't only have to worry about getting it through these membranes, right? There's these VDACs, so these voltage-dependent ion channels that push nucleotides in and out. You have to worry about those. You have to worry about the overall spin. So I talk about the spin of the mitochondria. Yeah. And that's why we start off with talking about things more at the subquantum level, because everything's more of a spin or resonance or coherence, right? So if mitochondria are spinning, which again, we all learned this in school that like ATP gets produced via ATPase. So there's a spin to everything. Mitochondria, as they're spinning, if we put like a number on it millivoltage wise, it's like negative 150, 200. Again, rough numbers, they're going to change drastically from person to person. But if you are hyperpolarizing or overspinning, as I like to call it, you are pushing way too much mitochondrial activity, which happens with a lot of people that just take way too many mitochondrial peptides that they're not ready for. You'll push millivoltages way too high. And then what happens? You throw off a bunch of ROS. As you're throwing off all these oxidative factors, you're spinning electrons and protons off. And that's basically causing your cells and your mitochondria to produce less H3O2, so less exclusion zone water. So now these mitochondria start producing inflammation, producing oxidation, and start producing less of the actual water we need to communicate. So if you look at like DNA, like in between is all this actual easy exclusion zone, whatever you want to call it, living water, right? So you're literally affecting the DNA level if you're screwing up mitochondria by overspinning and hyperpolarizing. The opposite also exists. So if you're in like the dysfunctional state, whatever, CKD, EGFR, whatever.
Chronic disease,
Exactly. All those states, they're usually hypopolarized. So that is underspinning. And mitochondria, when they're not functioning properly, which could be one of the main things we talked about beforehand, but if they're not functioning properly, they can't produce communication. They can't send those signals. That means they can't produce energy. They can't produce healing factors. They can't really do anything. And they'll slowly just get almost malformed and then just combust. Like they'll literally just explode, right? So the cool thing though about all of this is we want to find that sweet spot and we can grow new mitochondria. We can fortify our current mitochondria and we basically can govern all of this. So even though it sounds scary to hyperpolarize or hypopolarize, we can really dictate and govern a lot of this stuff with the peptides, the supplements, the grounding, the food, the water exposure, like all these things add up. That also adds a layer of complexity to it though, because you realize if I'm natural or on TRT, male or female, that also changes mitochondrial cascades.
For sure.
If you're getting your sleep, good quality sleep, poor quality sleep, that also changes mitochondrial cascades. So you can't really say that one thing doesn't affect mitochondria, but that doesn't really help anyone. That's the it depends answer. So in reality, we go through this list of checks and balances and say, get your basics done. Then you layer on these supplements. Then you layer on the peptides and the hormones if you need them. And you build up from there.
Love it. So question for you, is there certain biomarkers that you look at, or is it more based on like symptomology, which puts you down different avenues to say, okay, maybe this is a mitochondrial dysfunction, and then maybe what are the first stages that you start thinking about when everything is optimized for that person, like sleeping well, nutrition's on point? How does that cascade look for you?
Yes. So cool thing, blood work and a lot of the tests can show you both hyper and hypopolarization, meaning they'll look the same. So you can have a HSCRP of 10 plus or interleukin 6s of 30 plus or like tanked hormones, and it could be either or. So you know right away if you have poor lab values, the traditional inflammatory markers and things like that, stress factors, a stressed kidney, not so much liver enzyme like aspartate or alanine aminotransferase, more like the alk-phos and bilirubins and things like that. But still, if there's stress blood work or stress organs, one of these are off, right? So then to figure that out, you look into the next step of the actual biofeedback. Normally, if you are hyperpolarizing or overspinning, which means you're pushing mitochondria too hard, you're generally going to have the wired and tired feeling where you'll feel like God levels of energy until about 2 or 3 p.m. And then you'll crash and you will not be able to keep your eyes open. Like it is the most weird, tired feeling that you'll only get from mitochondria. And I've seen it so many times. You ask the right questions. Okay, that's mitochondria. You'll pull back on the 5-amino-1-MQ and the MOTS-C and the SLU because everything's in there. And then all of a sudden it fixes itself. And then, you put those numbers down, you were hyperpolarizing there. We don't want to go there. Whereas the hypopolarizing person, they don't have that energy at all. So they're almost always tanked, always tired. And they're more of the more anxious, high OCD overthinkers. Those are people with poor functioning mitochondria, whereas the people that are more highly sympathetic, overly just go crash, that's more of the hyperpolarization. So you also have to make sure you're teasing out the psychological aspects of things to make sure it's not just their personality. Because a lot of the overachievers, the type A personalities, they can already fit into that category, but that also could be from the mitochondria itself and their baseline. So that's another kind of next step as to where you might respond better to 100 micrograms of peptide A and your friend could take 10 milligrams. It depends on your own initial subset of mitochondrial factors on top of lifestyle and everything else.
And I think a lot of clinicians are still trying to understand that N of 1 practice right now. I think they're still just looking for this cookie cutter dosage that they can just be using. And I think the way you just stated it is everybody's so different. And I'm sure you have just found that it really does depend on the person, depending on what you're giving them in order to get the result you're looking for.
I do have to give a lot of props to different clinics out there because I'll usually mentor them or teach them or things like that, or they'll do it with other people. And a lot of them are trying so hard. Like they're trying to get away from that cookie cutter mentality. Yeah. But I can understand why it's tough when they have 500 patients a day or a week. Like, that's insane. I couldn't 100%. Imagine doing that. So I feel for them.
Yeah, and I would say we don't have anyone to go to. There's not a lot of people in this space innovating this yet. I hope to get there. We're all talking to each other. That's why we're here today.
Yep.
But so if you were to basically build like a minimalist mitochondrial stack right now for someone who's looking to improve that overall I'm always tired kind of feeling, where would you start and why?
So we'll assume, first of all, right, all the basics are covered. Hormones, like all that stuff's cool.
Yep. Try to make it as easy to understand, Slate. Yeah.
Definitely. So from there, the first thing I would introduce is the over-the-counter supplement urolithin A. As basic as that is, just drive mitophagy. Just get damaged mitochondria out. It'll also drive a little more biogenesis. And overall, it's just a good introductory player. It's not something you feel right away, but over time, through a lot of the cleanup work, and then also slowly fortifying more of the biogenic cascades. So to me, you could dose it a couple ways depending on how everything else is. You could do 500 milligrams or a gram daily, or you could do that same amount for the total week only on weekends. So what you could do in that scenario B would be push mitochondria hard and almost overspin Monday through Friday, and then do the cleanup work on the weekends. So that could be like whatever, like a SLU-PP332 on the weekdays, and then urolithin SS31 on the weekends. So drive hard, clean up the overspin. Or if you're more of the moderate approach type person, you could do the urolithin A lower dose every day, and then maybe the MOT-C to drive mitochondrial communication factors at 500 micrograms. Usually, I always like to start lower and build up from there. A lot of people with MOT-C, for example, tend to respond well to about 200 to 500 micrograms to begin, because you can always add more. Right? Like I would rather be able to add more than run into a problem initially and have to pull back from there. Because then you really don't know where your range is. You start off with a milligram and you're like, where do I go from here? So I would definitely say urolithin A and maybe 1 or 2 other peptides done in that way, depending on lifestyle goals and all that kind of stuff.
Beautiful. I love that. So when you are helping others lose weight, do you use mitochondria as this conversation, or do you choose to talk differently first before bringing in mitochondria to this kind of conversation?
Almost always. I feel like these days there's almost always a pressure on mitochondria. Usually, so if you are someone who's going through this fat loss phase and doing more of the stimulant route, there's almost always more of a need for mitochondrial pressure because you will downregulate those millivoltages pretty fast, right? If someone's pushing a lot of EGCG, yohimbine, caffeine, the clenbuterols, like whatever like that, you almost need more mitochondrial pressure. Whereas if someone's more not using the stimulatory sympathetic route, you can usually get away with less mitochondrial pressure and driving fat loss through Lexinox to pull down like the adipocyte inflammation, or depending on where you're trying to go. But almost always, I'd say there's almost always the intervention with mitochondria because you really can't get around that. It even could be like an ergothioneine, just get that BCL2 cascade going to just clean more mitochondria.
For sure. And when you introduce the concept of mitochondria, are there other markers that you tend to look at when helping people lose weight?
Yes. So I think the biggest one's going to be sleep and inflammation. I think in inflammation, I'm also going to put into that category the neurochemical dysfunction that goes with that. Because normally what I see, especially in 2026, now when we're recording this, right, I see a lot of OCD, anxiety, and overthinking. Those normal thought processes get magnified 100 times in a day. And what happens from there is that dumping of glucocorticoids. And all of a sudden, you're just liberating all throughout the day, but you're not liberating what you want to be liberating. You're not liberating intramuscular, or you're not liberating intra-adipocyte-based stores, right? You are just slowly getting more stressed out, higher heart rate, more sympathetic, and you're flattening out as the day goes on. Like you'll see as a male, if you have like bigger biceps, or a female, your bicep gets smaller as the day goes on if you're more stressed. So that causes oxidation inflammation as well. So I'm trying to accommodate for the lifestyle factors of, and that's like the social media factors, work factors, because everyone's overworking these days. Everyone is. You have to make the money to stay alive, right? But then there's also the sleep component, because then a lot of people will not just be stressed out during the day, but won't even sleep well. Or they think they're sleeping well, but they're waking up feeling pretty depleted and dead. Like to me, you should wake up pretty much good to go. You overdo some of the sleep supplementation. Yeah, you might be a little groggy initially, but you just pull back on the dose of GABA, melatonin, whatever you're doing, you can correct for that. But if you're not waking up pretty much ready to go, there's usually something going on there.